Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take the sources you've shared and really unpack the key insights for you.
That's right.
Today we're diving into the journey of Imran Khan. It's quite a story, tracing his path from, this huge cricket legend to a major political force in Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be working through the materials provided bits from his personal history, that book, Imran Khan, from cricket icon to political powerhouse, and BBC News reports as well.
So our mission here is to explore the really important moments, the influences, and the perspectives that come through in these sources. We want to get a handle on what shaped his views and actions.
And what light these materials can shed on Pakistan's complex history and, well, his role in it all.
Exactly. Now, it's important to say up front, and the sources are clear on this, personal story and national narratives are really woven together here.
Definitely. We will touch on some politically sensitive topics, naturally, but our aim is just to convey the viewpoints and the facts as they're presented in the material you gave us. We're staying strictly impartial.
Okay, got it. So let's unpack this. The sources kick off with his early life, right? Back in Lahore, Zaman Park.
And the personal history makes this really striking contrast between the Lahore he remembers, green, open, and what it's like today, apparently much more of a concrete sprawl.
Right. He talks about places you could hunt partridges, now just suburbs.
Yeah, and the canal he swam in, now polluted. It seems this environmental change, this degradation really stuck with him based on the writing.
And his family background seems pretty key to the perspective laid out in the sources. His mother, Pashtun Burki tribe background.
Yes, from South Waziristan. And the sources say she instilled this real pride in Pashtun resistance, especially against the British.
That connection seems important later on, too, doesn't it? When discussing the tribal areas.
It definitely comes up again. And the family's own experiences during partition are highlighted too, the migration, escaping violence. It sounds harrowing.
There's that detail from his uncle, who was on the border during partition. He apparently felt those 6 weeks were worse than 4 years in World War II.
It gives you a sense of the scale, doesn't it? The sources mention estimates, anywhere from 200,000 to over 1 million deaths, 12 million displaced. Huge numbers.
And that quote from Margaret Bourke-White calling it a massive exercise in human misery.
Yeah, it really sets a somber backdrop.
Then the sources moved to his time at Oxford. It provided an education, obviously, but the personal history seems quite critical looking back.
It does. It suggests it kind of created a distance from Pakistani culture and religion. And there's this observation about the elite back home sometimes ridiculing religious practice.
And this critique of westernization gets linked to the whole legacy of colonialism, right? This idea of humiliation, losing self-esteem, leading people to just imitate the occupiers.
Exactly. There's that anecdote, isn't there, about the lieutenant general suggesting he wear Western clothes. It's used as an example of this ingrained inferiority complex among some elites.
And they contrast that starkly with, what was it, Sicily, where Arabic stayed the court language long after independence from Arab rule.
Right. The argument put forward in the sources is that this imitation stifled originality, stifled leadership.
And this critique extends even to education under the British.
Yeah, the sources describe a deliberate dismantling of local systems, abolishing the WAF, the trusts that funded schools and healthcare.
Confiscating endowments. That sounds devastating.
It's presented that way. They give an example from Hoshiarpur district, where literacy apparently plummeted from 84% down to just 9% under British administration.
Wow. So the core message from the sources in this early part seems to be that all these things, family, partition trauma, environmental change, the perceived negative impacts of colonialism, they were fundamental in shaping his later views.
Precisely. It lays the foundation for this narrative of a nation grappling with its identity, its past.
Okay, so from that complex start, the focus shifts to his cricket career.
Which was, extraordinary by any measure. The sources talk about needing that ruthless killer instinct.
To crush your opponent, as they put it?
Yeah. And initially, that mindset is presented, quite frankly, in the personal history, as extending to a sort of contempt for the underprivileged, seeing them as maybe not trying hard enough.
Which definitely contrasts with his later focus. There's also that interesting story about Baba Chawla, the spiritual figure.
Ah, yes, near the Indian border, who apparently predicted his return to cricket after he'd already retired once.
And General Zia asked him back for the country's sake.
According to the sources, yes, leading to that West Indies tour. It's presented as fulfilling the prediction and making him think more about, well, unseen forces.
And then comes what the sources frame as a really pivotal moment. the '92 World Cup.
Yeah, the personal history goes into detail. He was 39, preparing intensely, apparently playing with a serious shoulder injury. He kept quiet.
And staking the whole hospital project on winning? That's immense pressure.
Huge. Especially with key players like Saeed Anwar and Wakwar Yunus injured too, as the sources mention.
And that victory, it wasn't just about cricket, was it? The sources link it directly to what came next.
Absolutely. Building the Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospital. The personal history explicitly connects it to his mother's death from cancer, and it's presented as the catalyst for this big shift away from that ruthless sporting mindset towards compassion.
But getting the hospital idea off the ground sounded incredibly tough initially, according to the sources.
Oh, yeah. That meeting with the Lahore doctors is described as really demoralizing. They apparently said it just wasn't feasible, especially the idea of treating the poor for free, which was revolutionary then.
They suggested just a small dispensary.
Right. And even his sisters were worried he'd lose credibility.
But he kept going. That encouragement from the Pakistani doctors in North America seems like a turning point in the narrative.
It's definitely highlighted as important. And then crucially, the sources describe him connecting with Dr. Tasif Ahmed, who then put him in touch with his cousin, Dr. Nashwan Burki.
His mother's favorite nephew, described as this brilliant pulmonologist.
Exactly. And Dr. Burki is presented as the one who took on the huge task of the medical planning, essentially making the whole thing viable from a technical standpoint.
So while Khan focused on the massive fundraising effort,
Dr. Burki handled the medical blueprint. The sources mention setting up the first small office, hiring the first employee. It sounds like a real startup phase.
and woven through all this, there's the spiritual guidance element again from Mian Bashir.
Yes, presented as providing really vital reassurance. Believing that Allah helps those with good intentions solves problems. There's that anecdote about the contract issue that just resolved itself after Mian Bashir's reassurance. It adds that spiritual dimension the sources keep returning to.
It's a recurring theme, definitely. Now let's shift to a major personal aspect that really intersects with his public life, his marriage.
Right. The personal history mentions his mother had actually warned him about the difficulties, marrying an English wife because of cultural religious differences.
And he notes his choice was more impulsive than rational.
Yeah. The sources also touch on how difficult it was for him, at his age and with his background, to find a Pakistani wife through the traditional methods. He found it awkward.
So when he married Jemima Goldsmith in '95, how was her reception described?
Generally warm at first, the sources say, but with maybe some underlying frostiness from parts of the westernized elite who perhaps felt a bit insecure.
But then things got politicized very quickly.
Heavily. The sources detail these media attacks, portraying the marriage as a Zionist plot.
Which the personal history specifically refutes, outlining her actual background, Protestant, raised atheist, though her paternal grandfather was Jewish.
Exactly. And this campaign apparently ramped up massively right after he announced his political party, just a year into the marriage.
And the sources describe a heavy personal toll on the marriage. Jemima getting demoralized.
Yes. There's an expression of guilt in the personal history about her unhappiness, trying to adapt to such a different culture, and just the shock at the personal nature of the attacks on family, which are described as being quite rare in traditional Pakistani culture.
There's also that interesting financial detail about clearing party debt after the elections.
Oh, the spread betting on cricket. Yes, the sources state he learned about it in England and got his brother-in-law, Ben Goldsmith, involved. Definitely an unconventional approach to political finance.
Which brings us right to his formal entry into politics, launching Tehreek-e-Insaf a year after getting married.
And the sources suggest it was immediately seen as a threat by the established political players, largely because of the public goodwill he'd built from the hospital project.
Right, and participating in the '96 elections, even though the party was brand new, only 6 months old.
That's presented less as a serious bid for power then, and more as a way to organize nationally, get the structure in place, and really bring the issue of corruption into the public debate. They knew the chances of winning seats were slim without that grassroots network.
Yet, the sources mentioned huge crowds at his rallies. Even then, lots of youth support.
Definitely. But selecting candidates sounds like it was a real challenge, trying to find genuinely clean people, but sometimes maybe losing out on experienced figures because of that vetting process.
Now, the personal history offers a pretty critical take on Pakistan's political trajectory up to that point.
Very critical. It describes this pattern of alternating military and civilian rule where institutions just never really matured.
And it suggests ethnic groups Bengalis, Baluch, Pashtuns felt sidelined, denied rights by a state they saw as dominated by Punjabis.
Yes, and the Kashmir dispute is presented as something that empowered the army, which also had a strong Punjabi element, further complicating things. The overall argument is that Pakistan missed the chance to really build on the egalitarian democratic ideals of Islam that were part of its founding vision.
There's specific critique of military rule under Ayub Khan, too.
Right. Acknowledging modernization and economic growth in that period, but stressing Ayub didn't fundamentally believe in democracy. And his one-unit system, consolidating West Pakistan, is blamed for fueling Bengali resentment that ultimately led to Bangladesh in '71.
And the alternating civilian governments of Bhutto and Sharif aren't spared either.
No, they're depicted as basically returning to power without having learned any lessons. The 1990s, according to the sources, were a period of real decline.
Into corruption, lawlessness, brain drain.
Destruction of institutions like the police force being politicized in places like Lahore and Sindh. Allegations of election manipulation.
And that Transparency International ranking is cited Pakistan's second most corrupt out of 58 countries in '96.
Yeah, alongside all the economic problems, unemployment, inflation, crime, the drug trade made worse by sanctions after the '98 nuclear tests.
So the core insight here is that his move into politics, as presented, stemmed from this deep conviction that Pakistan's ruling class and broken governance system had created a crisis, failing both its ideals and its people.
That's the picture painted, yes. A very bleak assessment, providing the context for his political platform.
Okay, let's turn to his perspectives on Islam and spirituality, which are woven throughout the personal history.
Right. The sources emphasize the idea that Islam spread in the subcontinent mainly through Sufi saints, through their humanitarian message, not really by force.
And he mentions his parents having Hindu and Sikh friends, not being taught religious hatred.
Yeah, noting that militant fundamentalism wasn't really a thing in his youth. His belief in Islam's superiority is rooted, as the sources state, in the conviction that the Quran was directly dictated by God, unlike other holy texts he believes were written by humans.
There's that story about Caliph Umar's conversion after hearing the Quran.
Yes, and he recounts a similar, very powerful personal experience hearing an Egyptian imam recite at the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad. He describes being immediately struck by its beauty, finding it relatable to Umar's experience.
And the guidance from Mian Bashir comes up again, especially after his mother died.
It's clearly presented as very significant. Mian Bashir is described as wise, humble, believing Allah helps those in distress, that nothing happens without God's will. This guidance apparently helped resolve spiritual questions or doubts he had.
And there's a distinction made in how Mian Bashir taught, compared to school or traditional clerics.
A key one. The sources say Mian Bashir didn't insist on rituals, prayer, fasting, but focused on explaining the meaning behind them. The idea was internal change comes first, external acts are empty without it, faith should develop over time.
Even referencing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, having initial doubts and being reassured by his wife Khadijah.
Exactly. It emphasizes a more internal developmental approach to faith.
Now, on the very sensitive topic of Islam, politics, and terrorism, what view do the sources present?
They present the view that the Quran, particularly through the lens of Allama Iqbal's interpretation, actually promotes social justice, tolerance, peace, equality.
The basic requirements being belief in one God, Judgment Day, the hereafter, and crucially, good deeds.
Right, with the explicit point that rituals without good deeds are meaningless.
The outrage over the Satanic Verses affair is explained in terms of
Deep reverence for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the ultimate witness to the Quran's divine origin and credibility. The sources actually blame Muslim leaders and intellectuals, like the OIC, for not explaining this context effectively to the West.
And the sources are critical of dividing Muslims into moderate and radical camps.
Yes, calling that distinction dangerous. There's a critique leveled against the westernized elite, accusing them of sort of hiding behind moderate Islam, while perpetuating the idea that ideology, not political injustice, is the sole driver of terrorism.
And Pakistani liberals are also criticized
For, according to the sources, failing to stand against human rights abuses during the War on Terror, for backing military actions and accepting civilian deaths as collateral damage, maybe out of fear of Talibanization or losing favor with Washington. The sources claim only his party and the religious parties consistently oppose this.
So the central idea presented seems to be that a true, enlightened Islam focused on justice and tolerance is seen as the answer, contrasting with both rigid fundamentalism and what's viewed as the compromised stance of some elites.
That sums up the perspective offered in the material, yes.
Right.
Which leads us directly into the impact of the war on terror on Pakistan.
Right. Musharraf's response after 9/11 is described in pretty stark terms.
As basically an immediate capitulation to U.S. demands, clamping down on al-Qaeda, intelligence sharing, base access, breaking ties with the Taliban regime, cutting off their fuel. The sources say this dismayed many in the military and shocked the public.
And it's framed as a failure of Pakistan's previous policy towards Afghanistan.
That's strategic depth policy, yeah, which aimed for a friendly, pro-Islamabad government in Kabul. This was seen as abandoning that.
The sources also question Pakistan's involvement at all, given no Pakistanis were involved in 9/11.
And they point out that al-Qaeda itself had historical links to CIA training during the Soviet-Afghan War. Allowing U.S. intelligence free rein to pick people up is also heavily criticized.
There's a particularly strong claim in the sources about the Pakistani elite accepting U.S. dollars.
Yes, a claim that they shamefully took money to turn on their own people, or at least turn a blind eye. Musharraf's justification is presented as primarily fear-based, citing that alleged threat from Richard Armitage about bombing Pakistan back to the Stone Age.
The treatment of non-Pakistani Muslims in Pakistan after 9/11 is described as, well, pretty bad.
Disgraceful is the word used, I think. Suddenly viewed as potential terrorists, denied rights, facing disappearances, killings without proper investigation. The sources directly state the U.S. contributed to these human rights abuses on Pakistani soil.
And they contrast this sharply with the UK response after the shooting of that innocent Brazilian man following the 77 bombings. Outrage, inquiry.
Whereas in Pakistan, the perception conveyed is that human life seemed almost worthless in these cases.
The sources mention him leading demonstrations for families of the missing back in 2003, and the specific case of Dr. Amir Aziz.
Right, the orthopedic surgeon, a volunteer at the cancer hospital who'd helped in Afghanistan, picked up by police and FBI, accused of supplying anthrax, and then allegedly disappeared. It's presented as a key example.
Turning to the tribal areas specifically, how do the sources describe the situation?
Pashtuns are described as natural warriors, but the aftermath of the Soviet war led to this huge influx of weapons, allegedly CIA shipments, diverted onto the market.
Leading to the Kalashnikov culture.
And a massive heroin addiction problem, too. Then came the CIA drone strikes, which the sources, quoting Zahid Hussein, call unprecedented, using robots to kill people in a country you're not officially at war with, apparently with government collusion.
He spoke out against this in the National Assembly in 2004.
Yes, and the sources recount him being attacked for it, called a Taliban sympathizer, while he predicted the military operations there would be a disaster.
And that prediction is linked to the September 2004 drone strikes in South Waziristan,
which killed over 100 people and, according to the sources, sparked a major rebellion by the Massoud tribe.
The sources also critique the government narrative around these events,
accusing them of lying, like claiming those killed were all foreign militants, and comparing it to the propaganda used during the 1971 East Pakistan crisis, where rebels were dismissed as Indian-backed.
There's also criticism of a U.S. demonization campaign against Pakistan,
portraying the whole country as dangerous, unstable, a source of terror. The sources argue strongly against this, saying a small minority of militants doesn't mean the whole country is about to fall to Talibanization.
And the Afghan Taliban success is attributed less to ideology
and more to their promise of basic law and order, according to the sources, taking over from warring Mujahideen factions, some of whom, like Hekmatyar's group, had themselves been CIA-backed previously.
The sources also stress the resilience of local culture against radicalization,
citing things like a PIPS report, the example of SWAT, and even historical examples like Syed Ahmed Barelvi's failed movement against the Sikhs centuries ago, partly because Pashtuns disliked his rigid form of Islam.
And the influence of Sufism is brought up again.
Yes, its tradition of tolerance, reverence for saints and shrines is presented as fundamentally at odds with the strict Wahhabi-influenced ideology found in schools like the Deobandis, contrasting with the more Sufi-influenced Barelvis. These are major schools of thought in the region.
So the core insight from the sources regarding the war on terror seems to be that Pakistan's involvement is portrayed as a disastrous mistake, forced by external pressure and internal elite complicity, which violated rights, fueled conflict, and was based on misrepresenting the situation.
It's certainly a very critical perspective presented throughout the material we looked at, a powerful narrative.
Okay, finally, the sources cover his vision for education, framed as a response to a national crisis.
Yeah, they describe the state system collapsing, a boom in private schools, but huge disparities. The rich send kids abroad, the poor sacrifice everything for private schooling, and there's no single unified national system.
And Naval University in Myanmar is presented as his answer to this.
Specifically aimed at tackling youth unemployment, drug use, crime in his rural constituency. That was the initial motivation described.
But the idea grew from a technical college to something much bigger.
To this vision of a green, self-sufficient knowledge city, an Oxford of Pakistan, as the sources put it, leveraging that partnership with the University of Bradford, where he was offered the chancellor role.
And the locals supported it, offering land.
Generously, according to the sources, the first phase got built, students started in 2007, graduated in 2012 with Bradford degrees, which were apparently very valuable in the job market due to skills shortages. The future vision includes tech parks, commercial areas.
Although it wasn't without local political opposition, it seems.
No, the sources mention rivals building a competing college nearby, spending more public money, but it remaining just an empty shell, highlighting perhaps the challenges of doing things outside the established political patronage system.
And this education project is tied back to the ideas of Allama Iqbal again.
Suggesting that implementing Iqbal's educational and social philosophy could help bridge that rich-poor gap, which the sources argue fuels fundamentalism. The best weapon against extremism, in this view, is an enlightened Islam, teaching tolerance from Islamic history's golden age.
Comparing it favorably to what they term European bigotry during similar periods.
Exactly. So education is positioned as both a practical and philosophical solution to many of the deeper problems discussed earlier.
Right. So looking back over everything we've discussed from these sources, we've traced this really complex journey, marked by huge public success in sport.
A deeply personal drive behind his philanthropy.
And then this challenging entry into politics, fueled by what the sources consistently portray as Pakistan's deep-seated issues: corruption, colonial legacies, religious interpretation debates, external pressures like the war on terror, and deep internal divisions.
And the sources really emphasize how his personal experiences, family history, those spiritual encounters, building the hospital, even the difficulties of his marriage in the public eye, are presented as being completely intertwined with these bigger national challenges and his political drive.
Yeah, key themes that kept coming up in the material were definitely the long shadow of partition and colonialism, that ongoing struggle for stable, just governance, the complex role of Islam in society and politics, and those significant external forces shaping Pakistan's path.
Especially through the lens of the war on terror, as depicted in these sources. It's a narrative where the personal and the political destiny of a nation seem inseparable.
So based on this deep dive into the material provided, here's a thought for you, the listener, to consider. How do you see that tension playing out, the tension between someone's personal convictions and these huge, complex forces of history and politics in shaping not just one life, but potentially the future of a nation? What really stands out to you from everything we've unpacked today?